Karibuni, asanteni. Thank you all for being with us. The name is Nduko. I'm the host on Kumbukeni. I am joined today by my brother, Professor Nware. I am looking forward to this conversation. I'll let him introduce himself. But this is a very important conversation in our community. This is, necessary conversation. Professor Nware, welcome. Introduce yourself, please.
Hi, hello. How's everyone? Otep of Argani, peace and blessings, shalom. All of the necessary hellos coming to our community. My name is Nware Rahsaan Burge. I am a professor at Keene University in Union, New Jersey, Medgar Evers College in Brooklyn, New York, and Essex County College in Newark, New Jersey. I am an award-winning documentary filmmaker. I am an educator. I've worked in the public school systems for approximately 20 years. Special education, history and social studies was or is my focus when working in the public schools. As a professor, my general focus is the social sciences. So I'm in the social science departments at the aforementioned institutions, anthropology, sociology, Africana studies. Those are some of the courses where my focus lies. I can add a little bit, I guess, about my background. I'm from Newark, New Jersey, raised in Newark, New Jersey. I pretty much have lived in Brooklyn, New York for about 15 years, lived a few years in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, which I consider like a second or a third city, you know what I mean? And so my history growing up, I went to elementary school in a public elementary school in Newark, New Jersey, Maple Avenue School, Maple Avenue Annex, big shout out. Then I was blessed enough to go to a school called the Newark Boys Chorus School from 5th to 8th grade. And this school, I was able to travel and see America a bit, right? I've had some early exposure to life and reality, learning to actually sing professionally in operas, in major symphony orchestras, American Symphony Orchestra, New Jersey Symphony Orchestra, Carnegie Hall, major musical venues where we had to learn to sing professionally in multiple languages, read music theory at a very early age. And so if we are aware of how the arts affect our minds, it affected me early. And I went to a school after I graduated called Arts High School in Newark, New Jersey, where I majored in music, but my focus was playing basketball. For those who know my history and my background, it's really all I thought about and wanted to do. I was blessed enough to go to a school where we had a lot of, I think, well-known artists such as Sarah Vaughan, Connie Francis. Some people know that Michael B. Jordan went to the school. Tisha Campbell from a show called Martin. And I'm getting the brother, it's the tap dance, Savion Glover. And we can go on and on with people who went to that institution. And then after that, I went away to college at Rowan University in Southern New Jersey. And then I got my degrees from two institutions, CUNY's, which CUNY stands for City University of New York, Medgar Evers College in Brooklyn, a bachelor's in liberal arts, and master's degree in education from Brooklyn College, and then have started a PhD So a PhD candidacy, which that's another story we'll talk about later. So that's pretty much me. Maybe we can get into the film making briefly. My mentor, Brother Patterson, often states, he says, "Hey, you're a filmmaker first, an educator second."
Mm-hmm.
As you see, my education history is pretty long. And I recently got into filmmaking around 2018, 2019. I would say 2017. And I went to a small public school in Philadelphia. So I don't have what's called an MFA, but it's a school where community school, I'll say, community institution where anyone can come in and learn to use the camera and learn how to make a documentary or film, but on a very amateur level. And I was there for about 12 weeks. I put together a film with a cohort of 8 people. And the film, actually, I put the film into a film festivals, which I thought at that time, I really didn't know what I was doing. I was brand new. Like I said, I didn't have an MFA. I put this film in, and next thing you know, it wins Best Documentary in Accra, Ghana. And then next thing you know, I'm traveling.
Tell them what the film is and what it's about, because it's important.
All right, so the title of the film is called DNA, Using Genealogy to Change My Slave Last Name. And because we're going to be discussing and talking about a lot of topics in regards to history and culture and more or less the importance of the connection of African people and continental Africans, I'll say that, and what's considered Black Americans and African Americans. I don't want to go too far into the film conversation because that would take us away from the topic. But I will say I have a film out now titled For Mothers Who Won't Let Fathers See Their Children, which is in a few film festivals now. I'm currently working on a film titled Black Beaches, about Black-owned beach property that's owned and lost by Black people. And another project, which is to this theme, titled African Athletes in America, which will be an interview series of independent African athletes living in America. So, which is the idea around that is to bridge the divide, connect the African Americans with continental Africans, as well as the diaspora, So that's the current focus. There are some other projects I'm working on, but again, the focus is about the discussion around the divide, right, of Africans and African Americans.
Thank you. And the importance of Professor Nware going through this long background, his long background, is to show that he's speaking from a point of experience, right? He's speaking from a point of experience of growing up on the streets in the US, in one of the towns that has been subjugated horribly and oppressed. And maybe you can mention at one point the Newark riots. Nware, we didn't even talk about that, but I think it's important. And making it through all those hardships and being successful as he is today, or not dying in the streets, not being in prison. You know, these are the unfortunate ends that our people meet when they're in these neighborhoods because of the challenges that they face. So it's important for him to give that background so that you can understand what he's been through to get to the point he is now, and why he is telling the story he's telling, and that he has the creds to talk about it. Professor Nware, let's start.
Okay, yes. So I'll throw this out there as I said I was going to mention the film thing, but the first film that I mentioned, the DNA, film did allow me to lecture at Oxford University, the University of Helsinki in Finland, London, Paris. I was able to screen the film and have great discussion and discourse at different institutions as well as academic conferences in regards to what's called nomenclature or anthroponymy about naming, and the importance of that as a person of African descent. And the subtitle of the film, when I said DNA using genealogy to change my slave last name, the subtitle is, and the speaking point is, should Black people change their white last name? And there's a whole history around that for people who may not have context. And so I said all that to say this project allowed me to see the world coming from a place like Newark, New Jersey. Luckily, I was raised with what I would call Pan-Africanist parents, meaning parents who let me know since I was a child that I was African. And this is very important for continental Africans and for people to understand who are from Africa, who are watching this broadcast here on Kumbukeni. And we don't have to understand that it's a different, we are the same, but there's also a different history that we share, right? We have similar socialisms, right? How we are socially, but a different type of background. Now, sharing a little bit of my background growing up in Newark, New Jersey, if I'm speaking to people also on the continent, there are a lot of stereotypes that have come from television and media that we will probably speak on a little bit later. But in urban Black America, not just Newark, New Jersey, and Newark, New Jersey, for those who don't know, is literally in the shadow of New York City. It's 20 minutes from New York City. It's so close to New York City to the point where people may not even recognize Newark.
No, but to the point where if you're on the train going to New York, some people get off at Newark thinking it's New York, but go on.
Thinking it's New York, right?
Yeah.
And if people see me or hear me talk, or if I go around America, anywhere I go, they'll just say, I'll tell them where I'm from, but they'll just say you're from New York City. And this is just sort of what it is. But in regards to the background of the urban cities, in the late 1900s or 19th century, well, let's say the 1980s and the 1990s, things were pretty rough in urban America. Places like Chicago, LA, Baltimore, Washington, DC, St. Louis, Newark, obviously, New York, Brooklyn, Harlem. It was very, very rough for Black people, specifically because of the so-called war on drugs, which specifically was a war on Black people, where they would give us terms as super predators, right? And so people who have done research in regards to the so-called war on drugs, as the, we could say, local, state, and federal governments are focusing in on urban Black America, what begins to happen is becomes a high incarceration of specifically urban Blacks. And there has been discussion and even some research, and I can't quote any of the research, where if these entities or institutions also focused on colleges or universities, white suburbia, or even white institutions, so-called white institutions, in regards to drug use or drug trafficking, there's a high possibility that there will be a high rate of incarceration of people who are white in the 1980s and 1990s because of the amount of money that they had to actually spend on drugs and the drug usage. I would say if you want to get more information, look into the Bureau of Labor and Statistics, that website, and put in dates and times if you want to get more information. So for people, I would say in the diaspora, specifically continental Africans, right? Let's say you're from Kenya and you are Kimba or Luau or Kisi or Maasai or whatever, right? No matter what your ethnic group is, right? If you're from Ghana, you're a Khan, you're Ewe, you're Ga, you're whatever, Bamaleke, whatever ethnic group you are, whatever country you're from, is very important if you want to understand African Americans and Black America, to do your own research, especially if you plan on coming to America. This is very important because of the stereotypes that specifically white media has created. And there's a whole history of that. And we could actually take a look at some of those things. And so,
can I quickly say, as one who came from the continent to the US, it is important for every single immigrant who comes from the continent to make a friend with Black Americans. You have to have them in your circle of friends. You cannot distance yourself from them, because they will help you navigate this criminal space, but also you will start appreciating what they've been through. So just as important as it is for Black Americans to have a friend from the continent and to literally make them your family, learn from them, eat with them, play with them. So that is very important for, and what Professor Nware is saying, when you get that visa, when you get that green card, when you get that ticket saying that you can come to the United States, before you even get that, if you're pursuing a life in the United States, if you're visiting, especially now with the Trump administration, if you're visiting the United States, do the research before you get on that plane. Learn about the cities that are extremely, extremely racist. Learn about the history of Black Americans, what they've been through, the civil rights movement. Learn about the challenges that they're facing now with the Trump administration. Because a lot of you Africans, I hear you saying Trump is the best president for Africa, which to me is an indication that you have no idea what you're talking about. So do your research. Reach out to people like me. Reach out to people like Professor Nware. We've given you some information that where you can reach out to us. Reach out to us and ask questions. We'll be the resource to give you. And even if we don't have the answers, we'll guide you to someone who does, or a place that does. Professor Nware, please continue.
All right. So to build on what Sister Nduku is saying, there is a word that we say called context, right? And when we say, and so you must know the context, right? The circumstances in regards to the settings and the events that gives you more understanding. If you do not have the context of American history and American culture, and then more specifically what we're talking about today with the divide of African Americans and Africans, Black American culture or African American culture, depending on how you want to look at it, you will not understand what I will be saying today, or when you get here, the stereotypes that you've seen on films and movies and these things. I'm going to get into that. And so and I'll say this, understand that the stereotypes of may come out of, again, hip hop or movies. And the majority of Black America is working class, right? We're talking about, maybe professors, educators, school teachers, people who work for the cable companies, right? Who put in your cable, right? Cell phone, people who are salespeople for cell phones, right? We could say, of course, big positions like lawyers and doctors, right? but we know that there are common jobs working in maritime, right? And multitudes of industries. This is what Black America is. But because of again, this what's called the stereotypes from a lot of films and hip hop and these videos and things that you see, Black America, Black Americans are put specifically in a box. So much so that even here, Black Americans will put themselves in these small boxes and not understand the amount of institutions that we've helped develop. We're talking artists, not just rappers, musicians, artists, painting and sculptors, and all of these multitudes and nuances of who Black Americans and Black people are that get tied into just a, for lack of a better rapper named Sexy Red, who's a female rapper who some people have issue with because of her overly graphic sexual content, right? Rappers that I may like a DMX, who's a great rapper, but at the same time, this hip hop generation or culture has almost superseded who or what Black people are, Black Americans. So much so that I'm a professor, right? And I may not be dressed in some kind of tie or even an African dashiki garb, but I wear to my classes sometimes, right? If I wear a baseball cap with locks, no one would see or consider me as a professor, right? Because of those stereotypes, right? We understand locks for us represents culture from our past, from our history, reasons why we may wear them. But if you're from continental Africa and you assume these things, even here in America, those miscommunications based on media will affect the mind and how you see a person, right? And even if I take this so-called baseball cap off, right, we may not know that it has like history, right? As a history professor, and I don't know if you can see it. You see on this side, you have different articles in regards to Black history and dates, 1863, which represents so-called emancipation and stuff. So this isn't just a regular baseball cap. That's another story. So again, the stereotypes of how we look coming from media will affect this lack of connection between Black Americans and Africans. And when we get into, let's say, the history, right? Understand that you first, again, like I said, no matter where you're from on the continent, and if you plan on coming here, or if you want to learn and know about more, our history here starts from the 15th century. Now, there's an argument about us being here before what's called the transatlantic slave trade, right, or the Ma'afa, right? So that's a debate, and I don't want to get into that right now. But there's something called modernity, right? You can write this down if you've never heard the term modernity, discussing current times in the West.
Could you please spell the word out?
Modernity, modern.
Modernity.
Yeah, modernity, right? Modernity, modernity. And so we're talking about from the 15th century up to now, right? Which would be considered modern times, right? And so I often say, if you have a clock, right, and it's 11 and it's 11 o'clock to 12 o'clock, you're only getting 15 minutes, right? You're getting 11:45 to 12 o'clock when you get history in the West or in the Americas. You're only getting the 15th century up to now, which isn't much history at all. When you talk about that other 45 minutes of global history, when we're talking about Nile Valley civilization, when we talk about great civilizations, the Ashanti kingdom, Zulu kingdoms, Mali, Songhai, Timbuktu, Merowe. We can even talk about the Moors in Spain. All of these great histories that we'll never know or learn about if we don't do our due diligence. But modernity, that 15th century up to now, is the majority of time here in the Americas, or specifically America, which is the Ma'afa. You can Google MAAFA, or specifically chattel slavery and the transatlantic slave trade. All right. Terms that I think an African should know or understand. And I need, for those who are listening, some may be already well aware of this information. And I say this to my students, but there are many who may have never heard of this information before. And you have to take that into consideration. Words like colonialism, right? Finding out what colonialism means, imperialism, right? Neo-colonialism. So not just modernity in these things, right? What does East and West refer to, right? And then most importantly, when we talk about racism, right? Scientific racism. These are things you could just Google and look up, right? It's a real thing. When I say scientific racism, and if you Google it, you'll see information that discusses and tells you specifically what's going on with scientific racism. And this is the beginning of the mindset that begins with Africans or African Americans. And so when we talk about the 15th century, we're talking about the Portuguese and the Spanish going into the continent of Africa, going into Benin, going into what's now known as the Ghana Ashanti regions, or Ghana, right? Going into the Igbo, Yoruba regions, Nigeria, Hausa, going into Senegal, right? And taking our people from the continent to the Americas, right? To Bahia, Brazil, to what's now known as Jamaica, Cuba, Puerto Rico, and up into the South, into the Americas, right? So this is very important, just basic general information to understand. As we're brought here, many of us, and when we talk about our ethnic group, right, our specific ethnic groups, we're talking about Yoruba, Igbo, Akan, Ashanti, Ewega, those that I mentioned. I talked about Bamaleke. I talked about different ethnic groups. These are all the different groups that we are as being brought to the Americas. We are able to maintain some of our history and heritage and our culture in regards to our rhythm, the drum, how we were able to speak to each other as we learned English, right, from the peasant class. Understand that we didn't learn the Queen's English, right? We were learning literally a broken English from a peasant class coming from Europe. So the type of English that we're even learning is broken English officially. And then we're taking our dialects from whichever ethnic group we're from, and now juxtaposing that and creating the amalgamation of English that you hear.
And just to be specific, so that we don't miss that fact there, Professor Nware, we're talking about the white people who came from England into the Americas, invaded the Americas and called it their land. That's who we're talking about. They were the lower class of England and spoke broken English, but go on.
Yeah, and it's because as a there would literally have to be bullet points for us to go down to talk about the actual chronology, right? The time of how these things happen. And there's a famous scholar by the name of Dr. John Henry Clark, and there's a film called A Great and Mighty War. And in the film, he talks about when he learned his history. And he wanted to learn all about African and Black history. And his mentor, Arturo Schomburg, if anyone's been to Harlem, New York, there's the Schomburg Institute for Research, said to him, you must learn the history of your oppressors. So once you learn European history, you'll understand how and why they were sent to Australia, why they went to the Americas, right? You'll begin to understand what the Protestant Reformation is. And hopefully you Google these things. I can't go and delve into these things. But this idea of escaping war and tyranny in Europe, right? So there's a couple of reasons why Europeans came to the Americas. And these are things that you can begin to look up and look into. You know, why the Irish and the English and the Portuguese, Spanish came to come over here, right? The blocking of the trade routes, all right? Some may say. Some may even go back to a person by the name of Mansa Musa. You know who Mansa Musa is? He was one of the richest men to ever exist. He was a caliph or a black Arab who had not a migration, but a trip to Mecca, where he spent millions, they say, in gold, giving to the local townships, if you will, or local areas as he traveled to Mecca. And this story actually gets back to Europe. And so you could Google Mansa Musa to actually look at and learn and study who and what he did and how that transpired and how that actually affected Europe, and now open up the doors to let people know what the Gold Coast was in Africa and how much gold and how much wealth that Africa actually had. Now, which then leads to Europeans now coming into Africa for gold and in searching for these riches and wealth, because they weren't allowed on these trade routes as trading is going on throughout Eurasia and the Middle East and Northern Africa and all of these areas, right? So there's, you know, a chronology of history, right? As they come into the continent, trading goods, but also the major commodities. You know, we're talking about gold and salt and sugar, but the biggest commodity was us, the African, right? And as they're bringing us, the African, from Africa into the Americas, hence starts modernity from the 15th century on, all right? And so that's what's maybe simple information to some. There's some who never heard of this and don't really understand and know that that happened, all right? For those who feel and believe, oh, this is just general, why is he saying this? Understand there's an audience that may not know that general or basic chronology, all right? And so again, when we get into the 15th century, we have to understand going into the 16th century, slave codes, for example, right? As you have people coming into the Americas, there was what's called a certain type of 7-year servitude that Europeans
indentured slavery.
Indentured servants weren't necessarily slaves per se, like Black Africans. And so if we're going from, I'm skipping a lot of history, going from 15th to 16th century. 16th century, we're talking about slave codes, right? This begins, for some would say, the separation of black and white, right? And there's a lot that could be talked about here. Some might even say Constantine, when Constantine conquered, that was some of the beginning stages of the separation of black and white. When you fast forward to the 16th century and the slave codes specifically, because in Jamestown, Virginia, where they say 1619 first slaves were brought, there had to be now a understanding of, you know, of specifically Blacks being enslaved. And this is very important as far as understanding the dynamics that begin to play out in the Americas, the Caribbean, South America, and specifically America, which then leads to specific codes or laws that begin to be instituted in regards of now oppressing Black people or people of African descent, which then begins the stages of the psychological development of becoming what I would say imperialized or colonized. All right, you then now your language is stripped. Okay, this is very important to understand. Once you strip the language, it affects how you even process information. Your religion is stripped. Okay, for those who are very religious in regards to the Abrahamics, your religion is stripped. Now, it doesn't mean that there weren't Muslims that were brought to the Americas. But if you understand history and culture, and if you read a lot of our African spirituality or
spirituality, thank you, yeah,
are strict from the gate because, again, this is the basic general tenets of imperialization. If you're speaking your language, your tongue could be cut out, right? If you are these ways to communicate with each other, although we maintain them through secret messaging, but this is very key in regards to the colonization process, right? The stripping of your name, the stripping of your language, the stripping of your religion. All right, these are the first most important things that begin to take place.
And I'll quickly,
16th centuries, yes.
Nware, let me step in quickly. I'll quickly remind those of you who've watched the movie Roots, if you remember when Kunta Kinte is being whipped so that he can stop calling himself his African name, and he's whipped and whipped and whipped until he agrees to call himself Toby. So this is not just a matter of you're not going to be fed if you don't call yourself this name, or this is your new name, follow it. No, it was you were tortured until you accepted this slave name. Go on, Professor Nware.
Yeah, the overt physical violence, right? And one thing I teach in one of my courses called Films of the African World Experience, I first show all of the ethnic groups, such as the Berserks, the Visigoth, the Vandals, right? When we say vandalism, right? The Vandals, these are
white ethnic groups, for your information. Go on.
Yeah, these are white ethnic groups, right? For example, I'm jumping around, right? The term slave comes from a word called Slavic, which the first slaves are white Europeans who were enslaved by Arabs and other Europeans, right? Slavic, Slavic is where the term slave comes from, first of all. But when you get into these ethnic groups who were savages, is another ethnic term. We know barbarians, right? These are all ethnic terms, and there was a certain type of viciousness of war and fighting that went on within these groups in Europe, and you can Google it and look it up. And so this type of war and fighting continued for centuries. And so when you get into the dark ages, if you will, right? And fast forwarding, right? And again, this is chronology. Hopefully you Google these things, research and look it up for yourself. There's a lot of sadistic things that Europeans were doing to each other, right? Create a big bird cage and put a person in there, put food on them and have them, pecked to death, right? Tying up the arms and the legs to horses and having the horses run and then pulling off all of the your extremities, right?
Pouring hot tar on each other.
Hot tar. But some of the most sadistic methods of degrading and killing and murdering people they were doing to each other. And so I discuss and show some of this so that when you see some of the torture chambers that they were using during these times in the medieval ages or the dark ages with each other, then you'll see these same things used during the slave trading, right? If you've ever seen movies or films or read primary documents of the head and the hands inside of a wooden, wooden chamber, whatever that is.
Yoke.
And these different things, guillotines, all these different things are what was brought to the Americas, used on the indigenous Native Americans and the Africans. And so again, it's the most vicious, some of the most vicious things that ever happened to humans when we talk about the slave trade. And so now, when you're fast forwarding into the 16th and the 17th centuries, we're now talking about a multitude of different events that begin to transpire, even in South America, all the way up into North America. I think one of the most important things for Africans and African Americans to understand is emancipation or freedom doesn't come from a change of heart or someone signing papers. It was through fighting, right? Through fighting back, through constantly uprising against enslavers, right? When we talk about, there's something called Maroons, Maroons, right? Maroon societies, and you can Google Maroon societies. The second that Africans were brought to the Americas, right? When we're talking about the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries, Africans were escaping from the plantations, right? They were constantly fighting against slavery, right? When Kanye West makes this, statement, slavery was a choice. This, for a lack of understanding history and culture, enslaved Africans consistently fought against their oppressors. And so when we talk about Zumbia Palmares in Brazil, when we talk about Nanny of the Maroons in Jamaica, when we fast forward, we can talk about Nat Turner and Denmark Vesey, that's kind of fast forward into the 18th century, but there were constant uprisings of burning down plantations, and killing slave masters. For our Africans and our Caribbeans, this whole idea of the witch, for example, right? Witchcraft, right? When we talk about, there's a film called 1804 about the Haitian Revolution that everyone should take a look at. And there's a specific part in 1804, and it's by a director by the name of Tariq Nasheed, where when we talk about these, the power of the African to uprise and to fight off the oppressor, you have the first independent country, Haiti or Hispaniola. When we talk about Spain and the Spanish and the French who controlled the specific area, the Haitians utilized their culture to uplift themselves and to be the first region, the first people who are enslaved in the world to fight and gain their freedom. And they did that by utilizing their indigenous African spirituality. So when we get into this mythology around witch and witchcraft and these things, and we've heard this explained for those who understand the culture. We've heard this before, but for those who haven't, when we understand toxicology or our agriculture, or our things that are around us, foliage and herbs and these things, you can create what's called poisons to kill your slave master, right? And our women were great at this, all right? Because you're talking about one of the worst human systems in regards to chattel slavery, with the murder and rape and selling off of of mothers, fathers, brothers, sisters, so, the cutting of.
Sorry, I was going to say, and breeding too, which is not talked about a lot.
Breeding, yeah, that's often not talked about, right? Some of these sickest things, and again, if you are African, on the continent of Africa, again, if you have access, Google, and you can YouTube some of these things in regards to what went on during this time period, because you can't fathom what's humanly happening. And so people of African descent are going to come, as creative as we are, come up with any type of method to free themselves and to seek liberation. And so getting back to the so-called witchcraft, all this is a concoction of whatever you're putting in the food or the drinks to kill the slave masters, right? And there's more history around that. There's way more to discuss and to talk about, but specifically where some of these terms can come out of, this is happening not only on the continent, not only during slavery, but also on the continent, as Africans are fighting against Europeans who are being taken to Africa. And some people don't know that. And it's been stated that there's probably close to 1 million or 2 million that have been prevented from coming to Africa based off of, I believe, the Ashanti Wars and some of the wars that went on in Africa against the Spanish and the Portuguese and the British. So it wasn't just Africans laid down and Africans sold each other. And I'll speak to that, the Africans selling each other. You have to also understand a term called ethnocentrism, right? Ethnic groups who have their own culture, belief, and believe their culture is superior. There's a term called ethnocentrism. And when you have hundreds of languages, spiritual systems, as well as cultures, each person is different. And some might even say that a person who is Xhosa or Zulu could be as different as a person who's black or white as an Akan or an Igbo, right? The language, the culture, the God would be different from a Zulu language, culture, or God. Two totally different ethnic groups, right? Or people. So now, fast forward, we'll say one people, one black people, right? And we'll say, oh, brothers selling brothers. But at this time, there's definitely ethnic differences, right? And there's these contrasts, this contrast and this divide is something that people don't necessarily think about when they say our brothers sold our brothers, and not understanding the politics of the Europeans and what the Spanish and British and English were doing, giving one ethnic group guns and whatever, and liquor or whatever, trinkets or gold, and using it against another ethnic tribe. All right, and so these are a lot of politics and contrasting events that happen. And when you study and research those times, that play a major role in the slave trade. It's not just our brothers sold our brothers.
And also explain the difference between chattel slavery, which the Africans who are selling their brothers are not aware of, and how they treated people they captured in wars in Africa. It's completely different. So once they start finding out what is actually happening to their so-called brothers, you have people like Queen Zinga who are pulling away from the practice. You have people in West Africa who are pulling away from the practice. So yeah, just explain that difference between chattel slavery and what was happening on the continent.
Yeah, and so so when we talk about the chattel slavery, right? On the continent, you have a certain type of wars that's going on that I mentioned earlier, right? When we talk about the Portuguese in Angola, whether it's the French in the areas of Senegal or the British. When we talk about Francophone and Anglophone, right? The reason why we speak French and English are whoever colonized, right? And so in these regions, when you have these a different type of war tactics going on to enslave people, and some people will also bring up like the warrior king, for example, in the Dahomey Kingdom, and what was happening there in regards to the slave trade. You have savage events happening, but when we're talking about sub-Saharan slavery versus chattel slavery in the Americas, I'm not going to say one slavery was better than the other, but within sub-Saharan slavery, meaning slavery that was going on the continent, you still had your language, you still had maintained your religion, you still had your name, like those three basic components, right? You may have even been able to marry someone in regards to who was enslaving you.
Or join leadership in the community.
So there's a whole different, I'm not saying one's better. What I am saying is there is a difference versus when you get to the Americas, the importance that the Europeans sought in stripping every aspect of the African, right? So
stripping your humanity is the difference. One stripped your humanity, yes. So
and so when we're talking about again continental Africans and them seeing a difference, there's similarities, but there's differences because of Black Africans in the Americas' proximity to white Europeans on a daily basis. And it's a different type of social, psychological behaviors that begin to develop from a daily basis for centuries. So this creates a whole different dynamic and dichotomy, because now you're no longer speaking Twi or Kikuyu or any of these languages that help you cognitively understand yourself from a certain perspective. You're speaking a broken dialect of English under constant oppression, and this will continue to affect people of African descent for years to come. And so when you have these type of dynamics, again, when you have the banning of us speaking, any ethnic languages and us creating a language, the banning of the drum, right? The way that we communicated with each other and celebrated, right? And so, for example, and I know it sounds like I'm going all over the place, but I'm trying to just throw tidbits and nuggets for people who've never heard this information to use and Google, right? You have an art form called capoeira out of Brazil, Bahia, Brazil. Even though I'm not in America, right? Black America or North America, South America, Bahia, Brazil, that's developed out of Angola, and it's a certain type of martial art to help defend. And so many of the plantation so-called slave owners or slave masters, when they would, or let me go back to the enslaved Africans, they would practice on each other. It was a kind of a dance form. And so when the slave masters, when it looked as if they were dancing, right, or having a good time, they were pretty much honing their art, right, their martial art, to be able to defend themselves and to be able to fight off their oppressors, right? And it's called capoeira. If you've never heard that, you can Google it and look it up. And so even in the Americas, we maintained certain types of fighting systems and codes and martial arts to defend ourselves and to protect ourselves during slavery. So again, we're just talking about generals that maybe people who already know this information. This is, might be kindergarten to some, but we have to understand to a broader audience. They may have never heard of this information before. And I'm not going in a direct chronology, 1705 to 1720 to 1776. But I will say that when we get into, let's say we go into the 18th century, right? The 18th century is very important, extremely important in understanding the dynamics of how things begin to play out in regards to racism and racialism and how these things are concerned. When we get into the mid 18th century, right? So slavery, some will say, starts off in 1500s up to now. Some will say 1619 up to 1863, 1865, right? At the same time, when you get to the 18th century, a lot of the dynamics that begin to frame the current Western world begin to happen. Please research and Google. Again, I mentioned scientific racism, right? When I mentioned that I teach anthropology and sociology, right? This is in the mid 18th century. This is the beginning stages of the social dynamics that begin to play out with European anthropologists who begin to start the study of anthropology, is the study of humanity throughout the world, right? And so you'll have Franz Boas, Charles Darwin, Henry Morgan, I believe Leslie White, and sometimes I get confused from teaching sociology and anthropology, right?
Was Blumenbach one of them, or what was he?
Well, we'll get into who he was, but like the Herbert Spencers, Margaret Meads, these are the people who begin to frame anthropology, and it starts out coming out of scientific racism. When you mentioned Johann Blumenbach, again, someone that people should Google. I think it's spelled Johannne, right? I should be, as I'm talking, I should be.
I just put it up.
Yeah, okay, I should be cheating, right? I should have the computer up. I don't, I'm just talking off the head.
Do you want me to put it up on the screen?
Yeah, put it, I see it. Johann
No,
Frederick
but the talking point.
Blumenbach, right? So when you have Blumenbach, he establishes the races, right? He establishes Negroid, Mongoloid, Caucasoid, etc., right? And he begins to talk about these 5 different races, which then begins to establish the racist dynamics, because now the people who have Europeans who are framing the social sciences in the mid 18th century, going into the early 19th century, anthropology and sociology, are now using a hierarchical framework under Charles Darwin and Herbert Spencer. All right, who's on the top and who's on the bottom? What group of people, creating like a pyramid, what group of people are of significance and who's not, right? And of course, obviously, they would have people of African descent at the bottom. Even when they would have some of these charts, right? They would have some, whoever was creating the chart, if it's a French scholar, would say French, then English, then Irish, and have their ethnic groups, and then all the way down to Mongoloid and then to Negro. These are the things that they were framing when we talk about these different social sciences, right? And when we talk about
I'm trying so much not to interrupt you as you're talking so that I don't
no,
right? But it's important as you say this to note that this is not their way of speaking of us from the get-go. When they first encounter us, the Greek, they're speaking of us in great ways because they're amazed by what they're finding out about us and the civilization that we have there. And there's a turning point where they realize if they're going to be selling us and justifying that we are inferior, the message has to transform. They can't be talking about us as these great people and then saying that we are animals. So speak to that, please.
So if you're, so Anthony Browder. So Anthony Browder is someone that I would like you to Google, look into. Is a person of African descent who is doing current research around Nile Valley and talks about these Greeks who studied in ancient Nile Valley, or what's considered Kemet, Khemet, right, land of the blacks, and who began to, who speaks on how we were lauded and celebrated, and talks about how the Greeks take our culture and our science and utilize it to develop their specific culture. So much so that, you know, we might not even believe that some of their deities, right, that we would say come out of specific Nile Valley or African cultures. And so again,
the Zeuses and all them.
Yeah. So if you're talking about continental Africans, right, we should be studying our cultures, right? Not to just jump off of Kemet, but what's very important in continental Africa is because of what's called colonization, imperialization. You have all of these beautiful languages and cultures that if you're in your school systems, you should be teaching the differences of these cultures, as well as the importance of the languages. And there's something called culturally relevant pedagogy. And what this framework is those who utilize their culture to teach. So let's say you're saying, as a continental African, hey, STEM is important, right? Science, technology, math, and these things is more important than history and culture. There's research that states that when you're putting your culture in your education system, or what's called a curriculum, your people, that's your ethnic group, or people will be more willing to learn or take the information better. And so that's, you know, I don't have control over who creates schools in Africa, but if any people who have institutions on the continent that are hearing this and listening to this, developing lessons around your own history, your own Kikuyu history, your own history as an Akan, your own history as a Yoruba, or whatever the ethnic groups are, and integrating that into the engineering or the mathematics and all of that stuff. Very, very important. Understanding that you can't expect the British or the French to not teach. And so one of the things that I often talk about is, again, one of the reasons why the divide has happened is because on the continent, there is no study or information about the transatlantic slave trade. You're not going to learn about general Black history in the 19th century on. All of
Professor Nware, just while you talk about that, and I've mentioned this to you, they even go to the extent of intentionally stopping you from finding out. Because, for example, I visited Fort Jesus in Kenya, and there clearly was evidence of enslavement of Kenyans on the ground in Kenya. And the guide is telling me, no, do not put that on video because of the contract that the Oman Empire and the Kenyan government have, where they help them maintain Fort Jesus, and therefore you're not supposed to talk about the enslavement by the Omani. of Africans within the continent. So this is important. The nations, the neo-colonialists, right, and the puppets that they use on the continent intentionally hide this information. You have in Ghana now, this is not the enslavement, but the government, the previous government that was there, preventing the learning of Nkrumah, right? Taking that away from the curriculum. So, and as you say this, Professor Nware, and I'm going to ask you, do you want me to put up the Word document on the screen?
No, you have to put it up.
All right. So I'll just prompt you as we continue. I'll just prompt you. So, as you say this, it's important to also, as we advise people who have the resources to start Africana, and as we have our brothers and sisters, descendants of enslaved Africans in the United States and elsewhere, going back to the continent and settling and investing, what we're calling investing. If you're starting a school there, please do not use the NGOs that are requiring you to keep Western standards, right? There's an amazing school that was starting to do well, but now it's taken on an international. And once you see that international system, you know the Mzungu has come in. So please, I know it's hard to maintain something that is authentically African, authentically Ubuntu and Mwana Ubuntu. I know it's a struggle, but we must struggle to preserve our culture. Otherwise, we will continue this cycle that is going to continue subjugating us, enslaving us, and oppressing us. We must be okay with struggling for a time to get to a point of salvation for eternity. Professor Nware, sorry.
So, and if you are, like I said, on the continent, right? Studying your history is very important within your culture and integrating that into your school systems, right? And that's very difficult, like Nduku is stating, right? Again, coming into the Americas and kind of what we, a little bit off base when we were talking about this history and culture, because it's very important. But if you're coming to the Americas, or to say you have no intentions on coming because you know how the shooting violence and the craziness is here versus other places around the world. And I will say that because I always make a statement that outside of military coups and gang violence in places around the world, when we're talking about just random human violence, America probably has to be one of the #1 places in regards to the things that happen that's outside of gang violence or crime or war, because we don't necessarily technically have wars here, but just random human violence is next level here that a lot of people don't get and don't understand. And there's a stereotype that it's Black people and Black Americans, and then when you look and under the statistics, who's shooting up the schools, for example, right? Just shooting schools up. Right, we know it's a young white male who's going to shoot up a school, and so when it comes to that type of understanding, you have to do your own research before you come, or if you never plan on coming, know that there's things that you should look into and Google and even read to get more of an understanding of the culture.
As you say that, Professor Nware, I'm reminded quickly something that is very contemporary. For those of you who have access to televisions, internet, and all that, look up white women and chimpanzees. White women and chimpanzees. This is another way of understanding these people's mentality. And by the way, when we talk about a general culture, we're not saying that every white person is a psychopath. We're just saying this is how they've moved in our history. And therefore, as we interact with them, we have to do it with caution. And I was saying to Professor Nware recently, if I had been warned of this, I wouldn't be operating blindly as far as interacting with white people. I would move with caution, right? And this is for all of us to learn how to move with caution, not to be 100% trusting and then end up learning the hard way that these people have this in their epigenetics, in their genes, that is carried through generations, this urge to oppress, this urge to own. So white women and chimpanzees, look that up. But Professor Nware, and then, if believe it or not, we've been talking for 1 hour 11 minutes. Like, we're almost out of time. We have to bring you back for part 2. But most importantly, after you finish the point that you were making, we're going to talk about the excuse me, the role of Western media and division, talk about the Jim Crow media denigration of us, talk about the war on drugs. We'll talk about the portrayal of Africa as impoverished, backward, and then we'll talk about FBA and ADOS, which is important because we need to talk about Tariq Nasheed and what he's doing currently. But finish your point and then we'll move to that.
All right, so it's very important because a lot of people like to Google, right? And so we talk about, I mentioned Anthony Browder, I mentioned Dr. John Henrik Clark, the UK scholar, Robin Walker. I would say, Dr. Ben Yakinen, Francis Cress Welsing, Dr. Ivan Van Sertima, Professor James Smalls, Dr. Leonard Jeffries. We can even
Dr. Greg Carr, my mwalimu, Dr. Greg Kimathika. I gave the link for narrative, so you can find him there.
And so there are PBS specials, right? There's a network called PBS, and there's a gentleman by the name of Henry Louis Gates. For African American history and culture, you can look at some documentaries and some things around that. Let's say books, right? Very important. The autobiography of Malcolm X, right? If you are on continental Africa, wherever you are, South Africa, Lesotho, Zambia, Kenya, wherever you are, the autobiography of Malcolm X, or you can Google who Malcolm X is and what he represented and stood for. YouTube, right? Marcus Garvey, right? The philosophies and opinions of Marcus Garvey, right? Very important must read in understanding the dynamics of Black history and Black America and culture, right? White guy, Basil Davidson, right? The history, Africa in history, right? Understanding and reading some of these things is very important, right? We can even go to Sheikh Anta Diop, right? The African changes in civilization here, the African origins, civilization. All right, Sheikh Anta Diop, to understand, another Diop book we have here, Civilization or Barbarism, right? These are things that would give us more context, understanding colonialism, imperialism, these ism schisms, right? When we're talking about, like I said, I teach sociology. When we talk about sociology, those earliest people, when we talk about Karl Marx, when we talk about Auguste Comte, who's considered the father, Harriet Martineau, these different people in sociology, they're coming in during the 18th century, and there's a lot of bias around it. Thank goodness we had a W.E.B. Du Bois. If you want to research W.E.B. Du Bois, Booker T. Washington, and Marcus Garvey, those three. W.E.B. Du Bois, one of our first sociologists who studied the history of Black culture, right? I noticed somebody said, because someone made a statement, I always make that joke going to, I want to go to a place called Black, when we call ourselves Black Americans, or Black,
Thank you for addressing that. Dr. Clark addresses that, right? Go on, speak on it.
Let's say I want a flight, you know what I mean? I'm trying to get a flight somewhere, and I put in Black, where are you going to go, right? And so you have to understand what ethnic means and have an ethnic group and a specific understanding of where these things come from. All right. But
specifically, which is important, so that like we're learning so that we can do better, right? Dr. Clark says you have to name yourself based on land. You can't just call yourself anything, right? Because And we Africans on the continent, and a lot of descendants of Africans here, understand the importance of owning land and having land that you can call yours, where you can grow your own food, you can live, right? If you're not associating yourself with land, Africa, Nsi Ubuntu, right? America, Germany, like actual land, you're a lost people. And therefore, to identify with Blackness as the main thing, yes, there's importance because of the history and how Black has been used against us. 100% there's importance. But beyond that, what is the land that you're associating yourself so that you can build security for generations to come, essentially? Professor Nware.
Exactly. I did want to mention Leroy Jones, right? Amiri Baraka, right? A blues speaker, right? Understanding, you understand African Americans, African American culture, different, different aspects, right? Not just hip hop and and R&B.
So for our next conversation, that's what we're going to talk about, right? The Newark riots, Amira Baraka, the culture, that side of the culture, the poetry, the dressing, and all that. Because I'm getting ready to tell you, please speak on Amira, and I'm remembering that I want us to speak on the influence of the media, the intentional propaganda by Western media. So,
all right, we're going to talk about that. But when you mention the land, it must be understood, and please Google Thomas Malthus, Thomas, Malthus, Malthus, the Malthusian theory. Make sure you people Google that, so you understand the scarcity mindset coming out of Europe that doesn't apply to the rest of the world. I always make jokes around the Marvel Universe character Thanos, for those who know this character, and any character in white or in media in Hollywood, anything that they construct of destroying the land or destroying societies or taking over the world and having to destroy half of the universe for the other half to flourish, and understanding there's the planet Earth can be healthy. That's a environmental elements is different of who's affecting the environment. That's a different conversation. But there's enough land and food for everyone, depending upon how people who have psychopathic intentions are controlling food. So again, read or look into what the Malthusian theory is to again give you an understanding of where these sociologists in the mid 18th century or these theorists are coming from that begin to frame the West and why African Americans move and think the way that they think if you are an African. And some of these things that create the divide come out of these Western, and the reason I'm bringing this up comes from these Western ideologues or ideological theories and these theorists that frame the West. So you could say that you're black all day, but you're born into a Western culture, right? And if those who don't understand East and West or Eastern culture and Western culture, that's something you can Google and look up and understand what those differences are. When we say Western culture, it refers to England, France, Italy, the Americas, etc. But there's also a certain sociology, a certain mindset that comes with that type of thinking that's very Eurocentric. And again, English language and speaking even a broken English cognitively affects your frame of life, which would be different from a person of African descent, depending on how westernized that person has become. And so those divisions, when we're talking about slavery or the Berlin Conference that splits up Africa. If you never heard of this, it's called the Berlin Conference. Otto Bismarck or something.
Right? Bismarck.
And King Leopold of Belgium, and these people who are slicing up Africa and colonizing it. right? Google and look these things up. There's plenty. If you're not reading the books, and there's plenty of videos. I showed a couple of books. There's plenty of videos that discuss this when we get into the mid 18th century, scientific racism, and like we talked about Johann Blumenbach, and then framing this segregation from Africa begins at this time frame. Now, the Westerners that have co-opted our mindset here in the Americas are now showing and teaching Africa as the dark continent, or this, when we get into 1860s into the early 19th century, as media is beginning to develop even more and propaganda is beginning to develop even more, you're now going into the literal more brainwashing. Because remember, as soon as Africans get to the Americas, that colonization and that imperialism begins to happen to strip you of your Africanness, right? Mm-hmm. To make you anti-African. So it begins to now, because you begin to mimic who you're around, right? And so this is where all the things come in, from the hair to the skin to the eye color. All of that develops on the
to the crime, right? To the crime.
Yep.
The so-called crime in the Black community does not just come out of us.
Exactly. And so as this media development begins to happen, and you begin to have in the early 19th century radio and film through Hollywood that begins to project imagery around the world, it's showing Africa in a negative light. So anything that an African American, a person from Africa who's in the Americas, specifically North America, hears or sees is negative about Africa. And it's only when you get into the early 19th century when you begin to have, or late 18th, I should say, scholars that begin to discuss the great pyramids, and begin to learn about Timbuktu, Mali, Songhai, like I mentioned, Merowe, Sudan, and this history, and how powerful and great it is, and that it's people of African descent that has developed it. Because you may have a Hugh Trevor Roper, guy from Oxford, who said Blacks had no history, right? Or Africans, there is no history until Europe comes in. And so people believe that on the continent and in the Americas, unless you read and research. So as media is developed in the early 19th century, a film called Birth of a Nation, right? It's a black and white film. It's 3 hours. It's propaganda. I don't know if anyone could sit through and watch it, but if you decide to do that, there's two Birth of a Nations. There's one that was made in the 2000s. There's one that was made in 1950. And I can't remember the director's name, but the film is one of the biggest forms of propaganda that begin to show Blacks as being, in America, as being negative. All right. There's a scene where it shows Black people because of something called Reconstruction, right? These are all terms, if you want to research Jim Crow, Reconstruction. Again, you can just read the definition if you don't Google and find books on specifically what this era is and what these terms mean, right? But this begins the degradation of Black people in America. And so as Hollywood is denigrating and degrading Africa, it's also denigrating and degrading African Americans. It's kind of doing the same at both times. So as the colonization and the Berlin Conference in Germany, and they're splitting up African regions into these countries that are controlled by European powers, they're also murdering, they're doing the same thing, murdering and killing on a continent, but they're also murdering and killing us here in the Americas. And denigrating our character post-emancipation. So we get fast forward to 1863, 1865, we're so-called emancipated or free. And remember what I said earlier, it doesn't come from some change of heart from Abraham Lincoln. We know that the South and the North, there's economic reasons of what was going on in the North, not North America, but the North of America and the South of America. That begins to determine what happens. But the main reason that slavery is abolished, the British abolished slavery first, and why they begin to abolish slavery is because of Black people uprising and handling or murdering their oppressors. And as that's happening, when these uprisings are happening, understand that if you watch 1804, all of these things, no one's off limits. Understand what I mean by no one's off limits when you're fighting for freedom. And that comes from babies up to elders when you're fighting for freedom. And so this type of understanding is what led to freedom, okay, not a change of heart. And so again, when you get into, so look at 1804, the Haitian Revolution. But when you get into the 18th century, I mean the early 19th century, and I mentioned Birth of a Nation, you have what's called the Jim Crow politics. I didn't mention Plessy versus Ferguson and separate but equal and all of that. That's a major thing because Africans may not understand, they may, right? But may not understand this separate but equal mindset. Like where whites were making sure that there was nothing interracial, no type of schooling is not the same, the utilization of public facilities, universities, colleges, because you may get here and ask, well, why do Blacks have their own colleges, HBCUs? Well, we had to create our own colleges because of that segregation and that history. And this is very important to understand. As the media begins to denigrate Africans, they start to, Black people here, they're doing it through cartoons, right? They're doing it like Disney. Everybody likes Disney now, wherever you are, but Disney is one of the founding companies who begin to denigrate all ethnic groups, but specifically African people. Warner Brothers, the cartoons, right? Bugs Bunny, and again, showing
Tintin, the magazine, for those of you who grew up on the continent, Tintin. But go on.
Yeah. So you have all of these cartoons, right, that are beginning to show and denigrate us through media. So now that Blacks are so-called free, you're now denigrated in media. They're creating what's called a blackface, right, where you have thousands of dollars is a lot of money. Hundreds of dollars is a lot of money at that time. So they're creating film, books, and even plays, right, with major bands and major orchestras designed to denigrate Black people, to imitate and denigrate Black people, right? They created movies and film, Tarzan, right? So a white guy in the jungle, right?
The Black people, the African people in that jungle who have lived with those animals for years do not know how to communicate with the animals. But this Mzungu who just showed up can communicate with the animals. Professor
Again,
Nware.
so this is when we're talking about scientific racism and the theorists and the mindset to maintain a racial hierarchy begins to happen. And you have something called phrenology, right? Phreene, I think it's Logy, phrenology. I'm spelling it wrong, but craniology, again, creating a pseudoscience to segregate and separate, to say Africans or people of African descent and Black people are not as intelligent. All right, so this is happening globally, not just in the Americas. Europe and America are at the forefront of pushing this narrative. So not just the cartoons and the movies and plays, right? But not only that, there's something called the Jim Crow Museum. You can Google that, and there's a video of a place called the Jim Crow Museum, where you have all types of trinkets made of, for example, a toy or some type of trinket with an alligator and a baby in the alligator's mouth, right? And they would call that gator bait, because they would do things like, throw our babies to the alligators, or use the babies to bring alligators up to grab the alligators. And, I don't even want to get into that whole thing. But these are some of the sadistic things and events that would happen on the continent and in America. When we're talking about, I mentioned the cartoons and the media. I mentioned Birth of a Nation, films and cartoons. You also have, I did mention theorists, all right, who begin to discuss or create these narratives globally around speaking in regards to Black people as subhuman. All right. I don't know if you can see me or not. I don't know what happened.
We can hear you, but you're frozen. But we can hear you.
Okay, so I don't know. So understanding things like the Reconstruction. Again, I'm in mid 1860s or going up, but you can read something called the 13th Amendment, the 14th Amendment, the 15th Amendment, parts of these amendments that affect Black culture. Understanding what leads to our oppression in the 19th century, because although these laws are made, right, to abolish slavery with the 13th, right, equal protection or something with the 14th, right, and the right to vote with the 15th, that those three things, it's not upheld, okay? And so this is very important, because when we get into the 19th century, it's not just the denigrating of our character, but we have to understand, if you are African on the continent and you want to know this history, around the 1860s, we supposed to be freed. So think of the amount of years from the 1860s to the 1900s, right? Let's say it's 40 to 50 to 60 years. It's not a lot of time, right? When we're talking about history. But understand, in those 60 years, 60, 70 years, whites aren't allowing us, we're not integrated, right? So we're not, building institutions with white people that won't allow that, all right? You have to understand that. So as we're building banks, as we're building our own institutions, schools, segregated and separated from whites who are extremely racist at this time, you have very rare people that were white by the name of John Brown. You can Google John Brown, and you had these abolitionists who were helping Blacks at the time. But you can't get it confused if someone's telling a narrative, trying to tell this story, and not giving you the real context of what was happening at this time. Constant hanging, constant murdering, constant savage events happening to Black people. So we had to stay amongst ourselves. I don't know if I hit the refresh, if that'll kick me out.
Try it. If it does kick you out, we'll chat and you can come back in. It's not the end of the world. Yeah, come back in. And again, it is an hour 35 minutes, and we haven't even touched on half the stuff that we were going to touch on. So we're definitely going to bring Professor Nware for a second part of this, because there's so much to cover, but it is important that my brothers and sisters on the continent understand this, because I am tired of hearing you repeat the lies that I was repeating back in the day before I knew better, right? And I need to expedite your knowledge acquiring faster than mine was, so that we can get on the same page and unite, because our unity is the thing that is going to liberate us. Our unity is the thing they fear. That is our power. That's their kryptonite.
Mm-hmm.
Our unity is the white man's kryptonite, and we need to get it together so that we can take away whatever powers that they have over us, and liberate ourselves.
Can you hear me and see me?
We can hear you, we can see you. You are on time with the movement, but I need you to speak on Tariq Nasheed before we finish. But go on.
Okay. Well, one thing I want continental Africans to Google. Now, some say this is not a document that's an official document, but it's called PRM 46. PRM 46, September 17th, 1992, from the Jimmy Carter Library. And that specifically has some information in there in regarding to keeping Africans and African Americans separate and segregated. And there's a reason for that, because you have Fela Kuti, a very famous singer, who comes to America and understands and learns African history and culture and gets more so-called radicalized. You have Miriam Makeba, famous artist from Africa. Same thing. Kwame Nkrumah comes to Africa from
all the first presidents.
Lincoln University, right? Hugh Masekela. We can go on and on in regards to this fear of Africans and African Americans collaborating to create to collaborate, and the fear of what's going on in Africa and in the Americas as Africa's gaining independence in the 1950s and early 60s, and Africans are fighting for liberation and freedom during those times. We're going to get to that, but when I spin back really quickly to remember what I said, the last 40 years, banks, institutions, there's something called Black Wall Street. And if you want to mention that, or if you want to Google that, there's Rosewood, there's Charlotte, there's other probably 20 to 30 places where Blacks are developing their economics, and literally whites are burning these towns down. And so these towns, or could be cities today, if you fast forward 100 years, because we have banks and institutions and towns worth a few $100,000 up to, let's say, $2 million, right, in the early 19th century. And so Google these things, right?
And this goes to those of you who are believing that the Black American is lazy, violent, doesn't want to work. The Black American has been oppressed to a point of, why the fuck should I work if every time I work and build, it is being burned down and I'm being sent to prison? So it is not in their nature to be lazy, right? It is not in their nature to not want to go to school. They now have been broken, unfortunately, by the system, because they build, it is torn down. They go to school, their resources are not being given, or they cannot get to a certain point, because guess who their teacher is? The white woman who's criticizing them, who's villainizing them. And it is a school to prison system, right? What does that mean? The Black child misbehaves in the school, the police are called, they end up in prison. The white child misbehaves in school, the parents are called, they end up suspended for a couple of days.
And you have a whole system developed like that, and where you still develop engineers, scholars,
exactly.
scientists, innovators, writers, authors, musicians, entertainers, great athletes, like, so in
scientists, right?
Scientists. So despite all of that, we still conquered and developed all of these things. Now, if you didn't have this type of what some people say integration into this oppressive system, that you would have even higher percentages of more scholars, more engineers, more scientists, etc. So there are successes, many successes in great art, artists, scholars, educators, and these things, but the numbers would be even double and triple. Towns that Blacks or Africans would be coming to would be, very high GDP cities or towns, townships, or rural areas. But when you have to study the 19th century, because the 1960s, of course, if you study the 1960s, you have the civil rights and the murdering and the killing and the oppression, the uprisings, the killing of Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, Fred Hampton, the FBI, CIA is infiltrating organizations like the NAACP.
See, there's so much. We have to cover that next time.
Black Panthers and all of that, right? But before that era, the killing of Robert Kennedy, JFK, John F. Kennedy, all of that that's going on in the 1960s. Before that, it's the 1920s. We have something called the Red Summer. Please Google that, look it up, watch the videos that begin to strip the economics of Black people to the point where when we get to the 60s, we're only fighting for rights. And then when we get to the 80s and the 90s, now you have, the 70s Vietnam War. Then you have the 1980s, the gas crisis that happens, and late 80s into the 90s, the Iran-Contra scandal, the crack epidemic, the 3 strikes you're out, the welfare to work. So you have legislation and all types of policies that's hindering, and still certain successes that's happening, but that's directed to the Black community. You have the removal, you have white flight, the removal of a tax base from urban areas that now, so there's a book called Black Labor, White Wealth by Dr. Claude Anderson. For those on the continent or outside that want to read Black Labor, White Wealth by Dr. Claude Anderson. So to get a more understanding of the situation now and what that is.
So Professor Nware, so it's 1 hour, 43 minutes. Please explain what PRM 46 is. I just put it up. The link is in the comments for those of you who want to learn more. And then please speak to Tariq Nasheed. Hold on. And I'm going to say that because this is important. We just sat down and watched this recently. A couple of Asian men speaking about this very thing. The civil rights movement, and this is my brothers and sisters on the continent who feel like they are the best thing since sliced bread when they come here. And like I said, I was one of you, right? And who look down on Black Americans and say, or you're told by your parents, or you're the parent who's telling your children, do not hang out with the Black Americans. They are trouble, right? Let's not hang out with the Black Americans. They are trouble. They're lazy. They're going to influence our children negatively. Here is the deal. Without the civil rights movement that the Black Americans sacrificed their lives, their health, their well-being, their comfort, everything to fight, because they're on the streets being beaten to death, being imprisoned. Dr. Martin Luther King was in prison several times. Malcolm X was in prison. And not just custody, right? Not necessarily prison, in police custody. They are being attacked by dogs. They are being sprayed by water.
Terrorism.
Right? It was just terrorism on them. And they pushed through. And if not for the civil rights movements, and for those of Africans who are talking about Trump is the best thing for Africa, he just took this away. He is taking away the agreements and the progress that was made during the civil rights movement. So this is the importance of being smart. And this is why I look at you sideways if you're Black and tell me you support Trump 100% with no apologies, because it doesn't make sense to me. You are literally voting against yourself and your people. You're voting for the subjugation and oppression of your people. So please, and I'm not saying this to say that Biden is better. Don't get it twisted. I am not that Negro who comes here to talk about Democrats and Republicans and which one is better. I know, Nware. I saw that.
No.
My use of the word Negro, I'm just saying.
No, it's what it is. We understand these terms. And again,
give us a thumbs up if you can hear us.
Yeah. And
So
again,
let me quickly address the fact that I used the word Negro, brothers and sisters, but because it is the word used to look down on us. And I'm saying we are not that. I am not that person who's going to give in to whiteness, who's going to accommodate whiteness, who's going to accommodate you and your accepting this way of us being treated and let it slide. No, I am not the type of person who's going to accept you voting for Trump, talking about economic this, he speaks truth and all that, when we are closing our eyes to the fact that he's bringing an oppression that was worked very hard by our ancestors to get rid of, again, aka the civil rights movement. So my point being, after all that rambling, if you are from the continent, when you get here, every luxury, every access you have is because of those Black Americans that you look down on, because of the civil rights movement, because they stood up, because even in LA, the gangs, right? You're talking about the Black Americans who are violent, who were selling drugs. Even in LA, there was a time, and maybe you can quickly speak to that, they realized that they needed to stand together against the system, and they did that, right?
Yeah, and so there's a film called Bastards of the Party. Bastards of the Party, and you can Google that, look it up, watch it. The gang started out as protecting the neighborhoods from, again, from white people, again, oppressing Blacks in these communities. And so, and many gangs even start out like that because of ethnocentrism, ethnic groups fighting ethnic groups, Irish fighting Italians, et cetera, et cetera. It's not why they start, but it's one of the many reasons why gangs develop, is to protect their culture, is protect their people, the older people in the community, et cetera, et cetera. And so when you understand the dynamics of how this begins, right? I didn't mention Bartolomé de las Casas. You can Google him. Spanish writes a letter to the Queen to now bring Africans to the Americas instead of enslaving the indigenous Native Americans, right? Or as they were, or oppressing them. You can read that and read him and look him up, right? To understand how this really begins. But as Africans in the Americas, there's a lot of new confusion, right? I call it new confusion, right? Through findings, right? So we have findings of anthropologists and archaeologists who've had findings of here in the Americans of African people, or people who would be considered Negroid, right? And when we say Negro or Negroid, we're talking about, when I mentioned Johann Blumenbach's separation of the ethnic groups, right? Mongoloid, Caucasoid, Negroid, et cetera, right? And so when they find, and this was something, when it happened, it was, I believe, on the BBC or on National Geographic, or either some site of, and I don't know the name of, just like you have Lucy.
What is it? I'll look it up. Mm-hmm.
So it was the bones that were found of what would be considered an African 30,000 years ago in the Americas, in South America.
Oh, I'll put the video, Dr. Robin Walker's video. I'll put it up in the
Pick that up. Mm-hmm. But that's something that many people who are in social science knew and understood. And there's a book called They Came Before Columbus by Dr. Ivan Van Sertima. So understand that when we talk about Mansa Musa, Timbuktu, and these major kingdoms, that there was already movement coming from Africa to the Americas, right? So there's Africans coming to the Americas, and you can read the books. Some say, obviously, Nile Valley Egyptians were making maritime movements to the Americas. And it's also, we need to remember that the Moors in Spain, the Africans, Arabs, who had the maritime science and technology, were coming to the Americas. And this is how Columbus and other Europeans gained the maritime technology to even understand and know what's beginning to happen around the world, because at this time they're not in power. And so when we're talking about the Americas, we have groups called African descendants of slaves and foundational Black Americans, and which begins to come in modernity, right? This is developed out of modernity, 15th century on. For those who are saying 12th, 13th, 14th century, 11th century, 7th century, of people of African descent being the majority in this landmass, you have to show empirical research and evidence utilizing anywhere from 2 million, probably 3 million, 5 million in research, probably a group of 30 to 50, scholars over a 5 to 10 year period, showing that the majority of people that are quote unquote Black are not from the continent of Africa. We're already here. And until that's done, then I will happily embrace the idea that we were here before the Africans. So we know that Africans have come here trading or helping to establish indigenous society. Who knows, right? But as far as the ethnic group of people that are already here, come from Africa in the 15th century. And so people who dismiss DNA, right, and will say, if you're locked up 40, I would say if you're locked up 30 or 40 years in jail, God forbid that ever happens, and DNA will exonerate you and make you free, you're not going to say, oh, DNA is fake or the science is fake. And, and I'm going to stay in jail for 40 years because I don't believe in DNA. Or you're going to be claiming all of this powerful heritage to Israel or to Kemet or to Africa. People will claim all of this great stuff, and it's been proven through carbon dating, archaeological research, and DNA. That's what's been proven, right? And so now the more people that are doing DNA, they're finding a lot of Neanderthal DNA in Europeans, percentages of it, which is now changing the narrative in regards of who Neanderthals are, because Europeans are finding that because people are doing their DNA.
Their ancestors.
Yeah, and you're also finding high percentage of matrilineal, mother's side, matrilineal DNA in people of African descent that come directly from different regions in Africa. And so you can't say that because you have this minority of people that are here in the that were here in the Americas, that there is this vast amount of indigenous Black people, and that's who we are. And you have all you have is a few pictures and no actual scientific empirical research over 10, 20, 30, 40 years.
But also, what's that term you usually use where the evidence is seen in your culture throughout the years? Retain?
Oh, retention. And retention is different. Retention means when you see the 2-foot shuffle in the Black church and you're feeling the Holy Ghost and the Spirit in a Black church, and you've never been to a Bembe or Yoruba or an African spiritual cultural event, the retention is in the Black church. The Black church has the most African retention that you'll see, and they'll say it's Israel or Jesus, which I can understand. It's African retention. You see in Santeria, Candomblé, Lukumi, in the Caribbean.
The braiding of our hair.
The braiding of the hair, the speech patterns. When they study Ebonics, there's speech patterns, right?
The cooking.
Cooking, everything, right? This is what's called retention. That's clearly specific area of West Africa because it's not a monolith. And so until you can prove indigenous retention, the way that we sing songs, how we talk, hair, all types of things, right? Show those things. I haven't seen them yet, right? The retention that I've seen in study is clearly West African, especially when you go there and come back, right? And so when you talk about 15th century to now being brought here, all right, we're talking about what? Maybe 80 generations, 25 years is a generation. So it might not be 80. My numbers are way off. But you have X amount of generations that create a culture. Now, if you're telling me that culture that's created from 15th century to the 19th, to the current century, and you want to call it something, then I agree, right? But now if we're saying we're not African, because again, when I talked about early 19th century and the denigration of African people through media, it puts something in your head to be anti-Black or anti-African. So Africans will be anti-Africans, Caribbeans will be anti-African, African Americans will be anti-African, and create any other narrative to not identify with it, which makes sense. If all you see in media, they're showing you, because they don't show this when it happens in other cultures, just dead bodies, famine, and all these things. You constantly.
You're not seeing dead bodies of Ukrainians. No, you're not. Not all over the screen. Go on, Professor Nware.
Yeah. So when you're seeing these things, you're not able to. You're going to disconnect yourself from that culture. It makes sense, right? To not be a part of any of that, right? Why would you be a part of that if you why would you be a part of that culture if this is what you think you know about it,
what
right?
they're telling you it's about,
yeah,
right?
what they're telling
Everything
you.
is saying.
Yeah. So again, and when we're talking about FBA, right, and Tariq Nasheed.
Yeah, hold on real quick before you start on him. Let me just give a disclaimer.
Yeah.
It would be ideal for us to pull Tariq Nasheed to the side and tell him he's doing wrong. That would be the ideal situation. But because he has chosen a public platform and the damage is being done publicly, it is upon us to publicly condemn it and to publicly address it, right? Because the damage is being done publicly. It would have been great if we had the luxury of pulling him to the side, because he does need to be pulled to the side and spoken to. But the other thing too, as we talk about pulling Tariq Nasheed to the side and speaking to him, we don't know what his motivation is, right? We don't know if he is being intentionally paid by these systems that we're talking about to do this, to continue the division, because this is the extent they go to keep us divided. So we don't know if one of us, because you cannot have the same man who did, is it 1804, Nware, you were talking about, and you can see him. Those of you who watch that film, you can see him explaining and expressing comprehension of the system and what it does and how we have fought and resisted it, and the history from the continent to here to the Caribbean, all of that. You can't have that same individual turn around now and start spewing hate and spewing false information, some of it true, but understanding very well why it's happening and not giving that context and misleading people. It just doesn't make sense. So please, Professor Nware, speak to this, because this is very important. We must condemn what he's doing.
Yeah, I'm a huge fan of Tariq Nasheed. Always been a huge fan of him, but have to segregate, well, not segregate, but just kind of leave it alone, only because I totally understand his stance. Totally understand it. I've experienced all of it, right?
But explain that, because please explain that.
So there's a guy by the name of Dick Gregory. Please research Dick Gregory and who Dick Gregory is. Great comedian, part of civil rights, helped fund money with Dr. King, friends of Dr. King and Malcolm X, and an avid reader, just reads and reads and reads and reads. I see Tariq Nasheed as the same thing, where he reads, but also looks into these sites, right? Looks into websites and all of these different sites and stuff. Like it's crazy. Like this is what he does. And so I personally experience Caribbeans and Africans making negative comments about African Americans, the same conversation that you had, right? And so there are sites, Clubhouse and all stuff that we don't know about, right? Because as African Americans, on plantation slavery, all through the 18th, 19th, all through, we've done things and made things to pass time as slave, right? Having jokes with each other, joking with each other, and talking about each other was one of those things, right? That we still do in our community. So if you're an African or you're Caribbean or anyone who comes from another country to the Americas and you don't understand this culture, you're going to be highly offended, and rightfully so. And so name calling and joking, and this is something we constantly did to each other and we do to other people. Racism refers to people who have power and who can control if you get jobs or not. So prejudice and bias is a little bit different. We don't have the power to control we didn't have the power to control some of these things. So when Africans are coming and they say, oh, blacks have been racist. No, not racist towards Africans, but may have definitely made jokes about accents, about coming on boats and all of these things, right? Absolutely. Made all kind of jokes and types of behaviors, mostly in jest and in fun, but then sometimes being ignorant and naive and being wicked. And both of these things are true. At the same time, you have the idea and of many Caribbeans and Africans who have said negative, direct things to me, right? And made comments, just all types of stuff that you hear. And I've had great discussions with them to break that type of psychosis or psychology. And so Tariq Nasheed has taken this and I understand why he did it. I just don't agree with the some of the ways that he embraces the dynamics of it. And there could be more of a collaboration instead of a segregation and separation. Now, when you do have Black people from the Caribbean and from Africa who get political, corporate positions, political positions in state, federal governments, and that are doing things against reparations, doing things against the advancement of Black American people that we fought so hard for, that's very important to call that out and to bring that up, because we already have Black people who are anti-Black. Many Black people are anti-Black, right? We support white supremacy probably more than white people. And I hate to put it in those type of terms, but there's things that we do subconsciously that uphold white supremacy, maybe more than them, in regards to how we are the pride of us carrying their slave names, right? We give them their surname in slavery, and we take pride in it, and we'll make any type of cognitive dissonance, allegory of the cave kind of mindset statement to go against that, right? So we do these things, but the jokes that he makes and the things that he says, again, that's just a whole different thing, like, saying that they smell and all this other stuff. And so you have hundreds and hundreds and maybe into the thousands of people who don't read culture, who don't understand the dynamics of the history, and are never going to read. They're only going to go by what he says and look at some TikTok blurbs. And then now you're developing a culture of bias towards people of African descent and Caribbean descent when you have a collective of racism around the world. And so he's creating a real divide. Now, you do have Africans and Caribbeans who pop up on his platform who he supports, that understands these dynamics. But most cases, that's not the case. Unless you are an African or Caribbean who goes to a HBCU or has conversation or has lived here and understands the dynamics, you're just not going to get it. You're not going to understand what it is. And you will do things and say things to further oppress specific African Americans in many dynamic, in many ways, especially if you get into a position of power. When we already have Black Americans who are constantly subjugating and elevating, Eurocentrism and politics in a certain way that's anti-Black and anti-African American. And so, again, I like all his films. His films are great. And he's funny. He makes jokes and funny jokes. But then when he makes denigrating jokes about people from the continent and people from Caribbean, and then other people, I'll be, times I watch and I'm looking in the chat and you got all kind of people saying all kind of stuff. And it's just like, I had to leave it alone because, again, it's antithetical to what we need to be doing collectively. All right. People are celebrating, Haitians being sent back, Jamaicans being sent back. Those ain't our people. You gotta, do for self and all of that. And not understanding that many are already integrated socially and culturally and are not anti-African American. So there are many who aren't. All right. So, you don't know who's who, but now to say, hey, be all happy, and also now begin to make calls to sell these people out, because I know people are doing that. Yep. Again, now you've fallen right into the hands of a bigger issue. All right. And taking pride of ADOS, FBA, and what that is, which is a new thing, right? And I don't, until I see a comprehensive documentary with empirical research and writings, when we see the evidence, when people say there's evidence in Grand Canyon and these places that show indigenous African-looking people, or Negroid, or whatever, people that don't look Asiatic, like the lighter indigenous or white European, etc. Show it. We need to, there's carbon dating. Take the money, do the carbon dating, write the book, make the film, so I can say that we were here in the hundreds of thousands and the millions as the continental drift began to happen. And there's a word for that. I forget what the word is. But Pangea, right? When the Pangea broke off, we were here by the millions. Okay. And, so, which is something that I don't believe. Prove it to me. Using Black scholarship, right? Because they'll say, because then it'll be, well, it's white scholarship and Europeans, and you believe the European methodology. No. Take African money, Black money, or indigenous, whatever narrative we use, right? With these new terms, take the money, put it together, do the research, and it takes years. It takes a lot to do this, but do it. So to say that we were already here, all right, in the hundreds of thousands into the millions, not 500 people, 10,000 people, or 20,000. All right, if we're not from Africa, then prove it. Then show that with your research. All right, even if you want to debate using the term Africa, right, instead of Al-Kibulan. All right, and we're using, Leo Africanus, and we're using this term, and we talk about self-determination and Kujichagulia and remaining, maybe we should be looking into changing that, if that's an argument, right? Why are we continuing to call ourselves African and it's another term, all right? Insi Ubuntu, right? Which I, agree to that you've brought up so eloquently since we've known each other. So again, this is the issue around ADOS and FBA. I agree with, hey, if you need to rid out people that are Caribbean African who are detrimental when we're in places corporate, governmental, that are antithetical to what African Americans have done, I support it, I get it, I understand it. But now when you're saying these people are keeping us from doing this and keeping us from doing that and all these other things and talking bad about us and taking the jobs and all these other things, and that's where I'm, I don't have agreement with that. Understanding, yes, there are negative things that they will say and have about you, but there's a historical context that the ones that I know, when they get here and they begin to learn the culture, they become very clear, the Caribbeans and the Africans, on what and who the enemy or oppressors are and who they're aligned with in regards to aligning with African Americans and understanding the narrative and the history and the culture. And I think that's very important when we talk about this divide and understanding where it comes from and the differences between political, when you're in places of power, right? And you are anti-African American and doing things. That's very serious, and that's what Truth Nasheed kind of opened my eyes up to, and like, oh, I never even thought about that, because as a Pan-Africanist, I understand, the oppression and how this is happening, and not knowing that people are actually doing that. And I think Africans, continental Africans and Caribbeans have to take ownership and speak to their other brothers and sisters and teach and educate them. Because again, the second they get around a Dr. Carr, a Professor Smalls, and a Dr. Leonard Jeffries and a Robin Walker, all of that changes, the second that happens. So that's very important in what's considered the divide of Africans and African Americans. My mother told me, and I ended here, when I was a kid, she must have saw something on television. And she just turned to me. She would do this all the time, right? So for example, the karate pictures we would watch, the kung fu movies, and some young guy is smacking up an elder, and she would stop and stand in front of the television and tell me, they don't treat their people like that. That's America. That America's, it changed the movie, and they don't disrespect the elders. So she would do that. So one day she steps in front of the television and says to me, those people are your cousins. Those Africans, those Caribbeans that are over there, those are your cousins. Don't never let anybody tell you the difference between you and say that those people ain't your cousins. I don't know what I was watching that maybe was sending me that message, and she would do this. So from being young, with my father and my mother constantly expressing their understanding of the connection, my father having traveled to the continent and seeing the phenotype and of the bone structure and the faces, and saying that, the story that we all have. We see our aunts, our uncles, until certain people open their mouth with a certain type of, linguistic tongue, you don't know the difference. So again, there has to be this bridge made. African athletes in America is what we're constantly working on, using athletes to begin to have this narrative of this very thing I've been talking about the past 10 or 15 minutes, and wish me luck on that in developing that, doing interviews and having these discussions, all right,
So,
to build the bridge.
I'm going to say to whichever athlete, African athlete who encounters this video, or to the audience who have connections with athletes, Professor Nware is calling out for them to reach out to him. They can get his information on that link. Reach out to him because he needs to do these interviews. It is important that we start taking record, and one way we can take record of our culture is through film, and he's doing this. A lot of us talk about, why can't we build our own? Why can't we do our own? Well, Professor Nware is building our own, not his own, our own, for those of you who are short-sighted and individualistic, our own. Through Nware films, he's going to be telling our stories. Through Nware films, he's going to be countering the false narrative. Through Nware films, he's going to be preserving our culture. And therefore, it is upon us, it behooves you all to support him if you can. And if you cannot, to connect him with people who can support him. So that's one call to action that I'm doing today, that Kumbukeni is doing today, that Professor Nware is doing today. If you know any athletes, African athletes who are now playing here, and may Mutombo rest in peace, but that type of athlete is who we're talking about. Actually, may he not rest in peace. I'll stop this by Mama Kanyisile. May he not rest until we are liberated, especially given that he comes from Bakongo. May he never rest until we are liberated. May our ancestors never rest until we are liberated. So that's the type of athlete that he's looking for. The point is to tell their story. And so we want to do this from our own perspective. We don't want, what's it called again? NFL telling us about this. We don't want the Oprah Winfrey Show telling us about this, because we know that Oprah Winfrey Show has white people influencing it, right? We don't want whiteness, the white gaze, as Maya Angelou called it. We don't want that telling us who we are. We want us to tell us who we are. We want
telling our own story. Yep.
Thank you. So support, visit the website so that you can learn more about what he's doing. Share this video, share about his work. He's going to be planning an event, and I'm going to say this without his permission. He's going to be planning an event in the Newark area around Father's Day for his film, for mothers who won't let their children...
Yeah, it's titled "For Mothers Who Won't Let Fathers See Their Children." Yes. And that's a whole narrative that we could talk about. It's a whole nother discussion in regards, and it's an all women's narrative, about 8 women talking about the importance of fathers and why mothers don't let fathers see their children. And that you can find through Film Freeway, or just putting in the title, and it'll come up and you can purchase it. But I one other last thing, not to jump back, but again, as a distant supporter of Tariq Nasheed, and like I said, I have to say that because of
I'm glad you're saying this, yeah.
So much great work he's done, man. Like because I'm thinking about it as you were talking, like, man, he's done some great work. But if you're denigrating character, though, man, like that is tough for me. Like, it's because, again, there's so much Black American history that Africans don't know and Caribbeans don't know in regards to our culture and what made us. It's not just hip hop, or like I said, and he's a well-read person, funny character, but it's like when you're denigrating, calling people, you're stinking.
So here's our.
I'll say it's one thing with you. Hey, your mother's so old, she owed Jesus a quarter. Or that's why you bald-headed with a hook part on. These jokes, just old school jokes that we would say. It's one thing if it's in jest and you're joking, and your mother got a wooden arm and she walks.
Those of you who grew up on the continent, you remember Mamako, yeah? And
jokes and funny things, right? You can do that and laugh and have fun and this type of thing. But when it's like you stink, and like, I mean, I was like, all right, I can't. You know what I'm saying? I can't do this. So I don't know, man. Like that's where I am with that. You know what I'm saying? And seeing people that don't read, and people that ain't reading and doing research and all that kind of stuff, regurgitating and whatever, taking pride in saying, hey, we have our culture, because that's the one thing African Americans will continue to say. We got no culture and whatever, and we have the greatest culture, one of the greatest cultures in humanity, when you understand language, music, the writers, the scientists, the inventors,
and the struggle that has gotten them there despite everything.
It's mind-boggling, the culture that we have and that we've developed. If you want to title it FBA, all right, I get it. But is it from modernity, 15th century on, and you're talking about those nuances and pride in it? I get that. I understand that. I'm African, so that's cool, right? So I can be both, right? Two things to be two. I can be foundational Black America coming from that time frame, but my ethnicity, if I do my DNA, is Bisa on my father's side. Big up Ibrahim Traore and Burkina Faso, but that's one of the ethnic groups in Burkina Faso. And then and it's 90% matrilineal mother Igbo of Nigeria. And then we can argue, there's a whole nother debate of autosomal DNA versus matrilineal and patrilineal and encompassing. That's a different discussion. But when they're doing all of this DNA, like I said earlier, as people are doing DNA, specifically Black people, matrilineal 90% West African mother side is what's coming up. It's not coming up, whatever. And then people say, oh, the science and white people control it. No, scientists, we have Black scientists, Dr. Gina Page, Dr. Rick Kittles of African ancestry, who I did my film with Dr. Gina Page, and there's a science behind that. So again, not to jump back half an hour ago, and I know this is a long video and everybody not gonna watch the whole thing, but and I hope that they do, but that's another story. But going back, these are the things that align me to the continent, and knowing that the continent is at the beginning, is at a reawakening stage of development, and we see that at the beginning stage of happening. The amount of land, the amount of prosperity that you can have, so many places you can go. If you
the food, the fruits,
believe the stereotypes, famine, all that. Go ahead. You know what I'm saying? Eventually, the right people will be there and go there. You know what I'm saying? And my suggestion is, if we encouraged by oppressors and oppression and fighting the oppressor, and that's our encouragement to continue to do that, then do that, because that's a part of who we are. We're fighters, but there's also something deep, a deep subconscious within Black American people to not lose our proximity to whiteness. And I don't, people are going to disagree with that. People are going to hate that. People are going to say he's wrong. They might take a clip and, how they, take clips and fake it and make it up and stuff like that. But there is a deep subconscious to have that life, the same exact life, the same type of house and the dog cart, like that same thing that they've seen growing up.
Because it's the American dream, right? That's what they call it.
Yeah.
Picket fence.
And they'll say, hey, that's not Black or that's not Spanish. That's no ethnic to that. But it is a mimicry of a specific culture that I've learned through time as I begin to learn certain things about ethnic indigenous African culture and the stark differences in behavior. A kissing a dog on the mouth or not. All right, different type of behavior things that are different.
And to you all Africans, that's not okay. But go on.
Certain cultural things that begin to coexist that would be considered Black or non-Black and all these things. So there's a bunch of things that are the mindset that people have in regards to there is no race and we're all one people. At the same time, you have a pool table, or you have these rules and regulations created by the powers that be in the 15th century during modernity that made these rules. And now we're going to act like, hey, we're all one and we're all, and I understand it. But then again, how or why are we, does this narrative of history lead to what it is? Welfare to work, you name it. The fathers, men struggling to get jobs in the 80s, in the 70s and the 80s.
Black men, African men.
Yeah. And if you're on the African continent, look at a show called Good Times. Like, it's an old show. If you want to get an idea of what the 1970s and early 80s was like, and the struggle. Because it's a different struggle. Like, some will say, hey, bathroom heat, running water, more than what some may have. Some people may think that. But the poverty here, again, all through our history as Black Americans, has been ridiculous. And understanding our poverty and understanding what that is and how it has affected us socially, culturally, politically, and economically. So again, this is a message to my, more or less to the Africans on the continent. Like I said, no matter where you're from, whatever, Zambia, Senegal, Mauritania, Kenya, Ethiopia, Eritrea, other Somalia, whoever's tunes into this, understand that there's a lot to gain contextually, to understand the African American and the culture that's been created, mostly positive and some negative. There's much to be read and to understand, and you have access, right? Let's say you're not going to order these books, right? YouTube, credible sites. Yeah, YouTube credible.
The Drazi Show, again, Dr. Robin, I keep calling him Dr. Robin Walker, Dr. Carr. I gave those. We have links in the comments. Click on those links, go and learn more about everything.
Listen to Amos Wilson. Hey. Listen to Nana Amos Wilson. Listen to Dr. Clark.
100%.
Listen to Dr. Ben Yakadin. Listen to these people discuss colonialism, imperialism, and how it affects Africa, and more so Africans in the Americas, in North America, and Black Americans.
And if you want someone from the continent, listen to Goge Wathiongo, right? Listen to Chinua Achebe. See the deeper story Chinua Achebe is telling in his nonfiction. In his fiction, I mean, yeah. So if you're looking for African people from the continent, they are there. Who can tell you? Kwame Nkrumah will tell you about his experience here in the United States. Dr. Clark will tell you about their relationship with Kwame Nkrumah.
Frantz Fanon was that White Mask.
Can't think White face, black mask. No, black face, white mask.
Frantz Fanon. Like there's plenty to read, but you can put it in YouTube or Google search engine and just whatever. And I'll leave with this, right? This last thing, right? The lady that would do my taxes is from Nigeria. And I remember one day, we were just having a conversation about, this was around the George Floyd uprisings and stuff. And so she didn't kind of understand, and I'm explaining certain things. And then she said, well, give me some things maybe I should read or whatever, or look at. So I wrote some stuff down to her. The next year I came in to do my taxes. I walk into the office and she sees me, and wasn't my turn to go. She just called me right in, and for probably a good 20 minutes was like, brother, oh my God, brother, let me tell you what I've been reading. And then she goes in on all the things that she has learned about the Black struggle in America. And she had heard some things and knew about it, but didn't know how deep and nuanced and how bad the happenings were to oppress us. Because I'm constantly talking about also the great institutions, the W.E.B. Du Bois's and people of Black Americans who have accomplished and done mighty and great things through innovation, writing, and technology, and these things. But she had no idea of the psychopathic, oppressive tactics, murder and killing that has happened over the time. You know what I'm saying? She didn't, but she had apparently over this year, she must have read and learned, and she was just in shock that he changed her whole understanding as an African from Nigeria to now socially and psychologically bridge and understand the plight of the Black African American, who seems to have it good here in the States. So
because that's the image that is being sent to Africa, right? It's either the negative or the bling bling, and it saddens me when I see Africans starting to copy that. I see now Diamond Platinum in Tanzania with his teeth and his chains and these reality shows on the continent. And I'm like, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God. They have decided to take the worst of it all. And instead of emulating the best of our brothers and sisters, the descendants of enslaved Africans in the United States.
Yeah.
I agree with you, Maboma. FBA is a negative bullshit term. Dr. Look at me about to call you Dr. Nware. Professor Nware is not saying that it's good. He is trying to explain to you the nuances, being part of the culture, the nuances that can help us understand each other, have empathy with each other. We are 100% condemning what they do, 100%, but also saying, as someone who's upset by what they do, step back and see why they're doing it.
Exactly. Because like you eloquently expressed about the civil rights movement, right, that helped everyone. You have to understand, like, as an African American, we'll talk about the negatives and the bad things. African American, we talk about it all the time, meaning taking accountability. You have to, as a Caribbean and African, take accountability to the understanding that people are doing this and saying this. This is happening. I don't agree, but if people who have created the NAACP and all of these things to embrace all ethnicities, right? Our people from Africa, Caribbean, to make sure that we have jobs, to make sure that we have food, clothing, and shelter in the Americas. This is things that our elders were thinking about and doing in the 60s and 70s, in the 50s and 60s. And also, you know, it was our plight too, but we were also thinking collectively and also holistically embracing our cultures and stuff. And you have to understand, if you're here in America, even if you weren't doing it personally, there was a lot of negative things that would begin to be said from Caribbeans and Africans towards African Americans. People will argue it goes back and forth, but at the same time, it was almost like a legitimate, constant, and consistent spit in the face, if you will, to African Americans that have fought and struggled. Yeah. And so there are some who, like him, have taken it to drastic measures, saying there's been a consistent helping of everyone and embracing everyone to a certain extent. And I could say that because as African American, it's something that I've seen many African Americans do on many levels. And then there's this kind of shunning that's told when you're leaving the Caribbean and leaving Africa. And so a mentality comes here. And so he's the extreme of the pushback. And I don't agree with it. And the idea of, again, a culture, because Black Americans say they don't have a culture. I've heard this over and over and over. I only agree with it in a cultural standpoint of what's been created from taking the African drum in Congo Square in New Orleans. And that's a music history that people have to understand, how music and culture developed from New Orleans up to Harlem Renaissance. That's a whole other lecture and discussion. But maintaining that and creating a whole culture, that I agree with. If you want to say, hey, this is that culture, then I'm cool. I don't technically identify with it. But if it's a segregationist mentality, it's why I don't use it, because that's where it seems to be coming from. some kind of y'all over here, we over there, right? Now, if I want to say, hey, I'm FBA, you Jamaican, you Nigerian, you're whatever, I could say, hey, I'm FBA, who's Igbo and Bisa. Like, but it has to be coming from our innovators and engineers, artists, musicians, sports greats, Muhammad Ali's, and these things, right?
You know what, Professor Nware, let's do this. Let's do this justice, right? Let's have another session just on Tariq Nasheed and the FBA and the whys, and we condemn what needs to be condemned, and we send them the message that we need to send them as far as doing better. So let's do that. Let's specifically have a session.
Because the term is a legit term. Like I get the term, but now
the importance mostly is through reparations, is why this has come about. It's true, and when it's explained to you, you will understand why it is that way. So we will have a session where Professor Nware will explain
that
all
other
of this.
Stuff,
yeah,
I can't. That's why I almost can't, because that's really all that, negative, that stuff.
Yeah,
is what you're putting into it, and now it's like, say, FBA is somebody that's going to call.
I mean, he sounds like a CIA operative. I'll be simply plain and simple. He sounds like the CIA sent some money to his account and said disrupt, and he's disrupting. This is what it sounds like.
I hope that ain't.
I mean, I'm saying this is not an accusation that is very strong, but I'm saying,
I hope.
Pattern we've been in history where it doesn't make sense someone with his knowledge doing the exact opposite of what he knows and understands. What he would do,
I see what you're saying.
Right? What he would do as someone with his knowledge is give the context, like we are, condemn the behavior of the Africans, but give the context. He cannot condemn Africans if he's not condemning the United States of America, the government. He cannot condemn Africa, not condemning the systems that have created the lies that make them behave the way they do. And he knows better. His films are evidence of the fact that he knows this.
And there's another thing, right? That he self admits of being petty.
And there you go.
And he self admits that. And I've again, and maybe some Caribbean Africans need to go in these clubhouses and hear the things that their brothers and sisters are saying, and then they might be like, "Oh man!"
And it's true. I have been on Clubhouse. There's a Somali movement that is pretty brutal on African Americans. There are Africans who are trifling on Clubhouse. And once upon a time, I had the patience to go on those spaces and correct them, but it's just too toxic and too much to consistently doing it without affecting yourself. Yes, there are Africans who have movements that are going against Black Americans and doing the same thing Tariq Nasheed is doing from that perspective. None of them is right. Neither one of them is right. They're both wrong, and they need to be condemned. And I agree with Professor Nware. We have to hold ourselves accountable. I have to admit that as an African, when I first came here, I looked down on Black Americans and questioned why they were not doing better when they had all the resources, until I learned that they did not have all the resources. So again, Professor Nware, we appreciate you joining us. I know you can be here for 5 hours talking history, because I've seen you talk. And you have lectures, 3-hour lectures, so I know it's
I didn't pull up any bullet points to
right
go directly to. All this is really off the head, so I was kind of like all over the place at times. So,
but all over the place, still making sense. All over the place, still coming down to the main point. We must unite. We must stop holding on to the petty, right? We talked about Tariq Nasheed and the pettiness, the petty issues that divide us, and start looking beyond that. Tariq Nasheed, what you can do is start speaking from a point of knowledge, and start, if truly your goal is the wellness of foundational Black Americans, you wouldn't be spewing this nonsense. You would be educating these Africans so that when they come here, they treat foundational Black Americans with respect. You would be educating them so that when they come here, they support reparations for you. You would be educating them so that they do the opposite of what they're doing to harm your well-being. If you're true
having a whole page where you speaking directly in teaching, and that would make sense to me, as opposed to like this, kind of sometimes vitriolic kind of thing. And I'm like, you know, for me, like I've heard things, but if I haven't heard those things, I'm just a different character. I'm not going to respond like that.
Yeah.
I'm going to handle it a different way. And that's really what that is. He's hearing this stuff. And because he's a Dick Gregory type, he's went into the annals of it. And now, you know, as he says, he's petty, whatever. And so he's going to now, you know what?
And I want to say, Tariq Nasheed, you're welcome to come and have a conversation with Nduku on Kumbukeni. But only if you're grounded on the well-being, because I will end the interview immediately you start being insulting, because this is what you do, right? This is what we are condemning. If you cannot have a respectful conversation, then please don't even think about it. But if you're willing to have a respectful conversation where we address the issues that you are concerned about, 100% you're welcome to sit and speak with us. All right. Thank you, Professor Nware. Have a good day. Support him. We have shared the link. Thank you all. Thank you all who are in the chat, who share, who participate, who share your opinions. This is a space for you. This is a space for you to share. This is a space for you to express yourself. And we are always happy to do this work and continue supporting our community. Asanteni sana, siku njema. See you next week. Next week, we're going to be sitting with our brother Oladele for our collaboration. I don't remember who's coming on, but I'm sure it's going to be informative. Asanteni, kwaherini.
All right.
Stay, Professor Nware.
Okay, yeah.